Thank you, and thanks very much for inviting me. I was quite excited to hear that I would be able to talk at the Royal Institution. As you may know, Americans are excited by anything royal. It's actually a particularly appropriate place for me to speak because I just was reading the charter for the Royal Institution, and it was set up, for one thing, for, quote, teaching the application of science to the common purposes of life. And that's exactly what I want to talk about. I have no interesting findings to tell you about. I just have something to tell you about using the tools of science for understanding the world that we live in. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. And by everything, I mean everything. The wealth of the average European basically did not increase for the 2,000 years before the Industrial Revolution. Our life expectancies are substantially more than double what they were before the Industrial Revolution. So we got healthier and wealthier. Did we get wiser as a result of the revolution? Well, I would be happy in a discussion to defend the proposition that we did get wiser, but what I certainly have evidence about today is that we got smarter. The Industrial Revolution required different kinds of minds than were around at the end of the 18th century, even in the most advanced countries. If you were to ask someone in the late 18th century, the laborer off the street or the farmer, so what's the difference between if you would say, in what way are a fish and birds alike? The person might say, well, fish and a bird's not at all alike. A fish can swim and a bird can't. A bird can fly and a fish can't. A bird can eat a fish, but a fish can't eat a bird. And that would be your answer to the similarity question, because there was no clear conception of categorizing objects and making inferences about them from some higher level in the hierarchy of the category. Logic was weak and basically never applied to abstractions. Hypothetical reasoning was difficult. If you say, well, why do you think you'd think about that if you were French? So it's impossible. I'm not French. I couldn't be French. How would I? The whole mode of thinking hypothetically was not there. And of course, there were enormous numbers of fallacies that people were not aware of. So the Industrial Revolution absolutely required the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And the more of these other habits of mind that you had, the further you would be able to go in the hierarchy of society. Now, the tools that I'm going to be talking about today have been around since the Greeks, but only possessed by a very thin stratum of people. I'm sure I don't know anybody as smart as Aristotle. So interestingly, the absolute top of reasoning ability was reached decades, centuries, eons ago. But it didn't go down very far beyond. I just was told at the time this was founded, there were only 2 universities in Britain. So this is where they had to do their research. There wasn't no university around to do it. So there's actually good evidence of the sort of hardest kind that psychologists can come up with, that we've gotten smarter. IQ tests started being given early in the 20th century. And between the beginning of the 20th century and the end of World War II, IQs went up by 8 or 10 points. That's a very large amount. Since World War II, in the rich countries, IQs have gone up an additional 15 points. Now, that's a standard deviation. To give you an idea of what that means, someone who scored 100 in 1946 would score 85 today. So instead of being average, that person would be dull normal. If someone who scored today, who scored 115, would have been considered a genius by standards of 1946. Well, you might ask, okay, that's IQ tests, but IQ tests aren't exactly the same thing as intelligence, and I would agree that's true. IQ is not the same thing as intelligence, it's not. But IQ tests certainly test things that we would want to call intelligence. If you ask a child who's taking an IQ test, why do doctors go back and get an education? The child who can tell you the answer to that question is smarter than one who can't. He's been able to figure out the world enough to be able to answer that. A child who can answer the question, how are revenge and forgiveness alike, is smarter than a child who can't answer that question. Vocabulary has increased by a standard deviation equal to 15 IQ points over that period of time. And the more words you have, the more concepts you have, the more concepts you have, the smarter you are. So how did this happen exactly? Well, the basic story is pretty simple. School, more school and better school. And at the turn even of the 20th century, only a few years of grammar school was typical of the average person, even in the rich countries. Today, 40% of British and Americans have a tertiary degree. So it's absolutely an enormous, vastly more time spent in school, 10 or 12 years spent in school. It would be surprising if that didn't result in people getting smarter. School has improved. I was struck to see some preschool materials recently, and kids were being forced to learn abstractions, to be able to deal with abstractions in a logical way. It was understood at the turn of the 20th century that you couldn't teach calculus to university students until senior year. That was about the earliest they'd be ready for it. And today, of course, it's routinely taught in high school. So the Industrial Revolution demanded that we have different minds, and it succeeded in that to a remarkable extent. It continues, by the way, in most countries today. It started in even the least developed, almost all of even the least developed countries. It continues to increase in Britain and the US. There is one area of the world where it's no longer increasing, which is quite interesting what that area is. I guess what the answer to it, why there's been no continuing change. It's Scandinavia. And I think it's likely that this is the case because Scandinavia just does a better job than the rest of us at bringing up the bottom, about giving every opportunity to people at the bottom. So those folks are, they've achieved about what we can achieve at the current level of what we're teaching in these Industrial Revolution skills. But beginning roughly in mid-20th century, we got a new revolution, namely the information revolution, which is about data, not things. And there are sharp requirements of being able to live effectively in the revolution, in the information era. We have to be able to collect data, have to be able to code data. That means, what is this data? How can I give a number to it? Have to be able to analyze data. Have to be able to manipulate the environment so as to generate reliable information. You have to be able to appraise arguments based on data. And you have to be able to choose between possible courses of action based on data. Now, the tools required for that are the same tools as the Industrial Revolution required, but a whole lot of other ones as well, namely statistics, probability theory, scientific methodologies, sophisticated epistemologies, and decision theory. For statistics and probability theory, the concept of a sample of a population of sample bias, randomness, law of large numbers, normal distribution, standard deviation, statistical significance, regression to the mean, base rate, and correlation. In many occupations today, if you don't understand those things reasonably well, you can't function effectively. And what I want to argue today is if you don't understand those things, you can't function effectively in your daily life. For scientific methodology, the bare minimum is concept of the control group, randomized control experiment, confounded variable, self-selection, independence of observation versus dependence of observation, the concept of a natural experiment and how to discover them, and artifact. In decision theory, cost-benefit analysis, the concepts of opportunity cost and sunk cost, and the notion of loss aversion, and how not to mess yourself up by finding loss so aversive. In roughly the beginning of the 70s, psychologists started showing our weaknesses with these things. Kahneman and Tversky are the most famous names associated with this, showing how these kinds of principles, because people don't understand them or because they're unable to apply them, causes them to get all kinds of problems wrong. I'm sure most of you know some of these kinds of examples. If you tell a University of Michigan freshman that there is a town with 2 hospitals, one with about 50 births per day and one with about 15 births per day, and then ask at which of these hospitals do you think there would be more days in the year on which 60% or more of the babies born were boys? About half people will tell you it doesn't make any difference. Of the remainder, about half will say it's the larger hospital that would have more such days, and about half will say it's the smaller hospital that would have more such days. What's missing is concept that everyone here has been familiar with, but we just don't know how to apply across the infinite range of situations where it's necessary. So that law says that the sample values resemble population values, and in the case of this problem I just gave, the presumed population value is 50%. So sample values resemble population values as a direct function of their size and an inverse function of the expected error associated with each observation. And you have to think of observations. This is not common for us to do this, but every single observation that you might make, the distance from here to Pluto, a person's height, a person's attitude toward a political candidate, can be thought of as an observation which is composed of true score, which is what's really the case with Pluto as God sees it, as God measures, plus error associated with it. And we have a good conception of error for a lot of things. We know that the height estimates, you would never bother to measure someone's height twice. I mean, once is enough, that it's the error is very slight. Probably the same is true for the distance to Plato, but all kinds of other observations that we make in everyday life, we treat as if we're getting the true score. I mean, nature wouldn't kid us. I've got the true score. No conception of error, which could be throwing us off enormously. So I'm going to talk about 6 of these tools today. You've heard of them all. You probably use some of them in your work, but you don't use them for a fraction of the relevant problems in everyday life that you encounter. We're not nearly as smart as we could be or as we're going to be. Suppose I told you I have a friend who's a business executive, and recently he interviewed someone for a manager position, and this person had a great record in his previous jobs. He had splendid recommendations from prior employers, but my friend interviewed him, and he didn't seem to have any interesting commentary to make on my friend's business. It just didn't seem too sharp, so my friend went back to his colleagues and said, I don't think we should pursue this guy, I just don't think he's material for us. Now, we say, well, that's totally commonplace, ordinary event. Are you going to tell us there's something wrong with that, Professor? Yes, I am. Compare that to a case of a university football coach who goes to visit a practice by a particular player, a forward, who's been extremely highly recommended by his coaches and has a great scoring record. But he observes this kid during the practice, and the kid just fails to make some goals he should have made. He just doesn't seem in control of the ball. And he goes back to his fellow colleagues and he says, I don't think we should pursue this guy, I just don't think he's material for us. Now that probably rings a bell. Wait a minute. Is that a great decision? And of course, it wouldn't be a great decision. And it wouldn't be a great decision because we understand the concept of observations equal true score plus error when it's applied to sports. Because we see it all the time. We see the star who usually makes 15 points per basketball game makes 2 tonight. Next week, he makes 30. There's lots of error around any athletic performance. That's captured in the U.S. for what we call football by the idea that on any given Sunday, any team in the National Football League can defeat any other team. We understand it there. We don't understand it with interviews. Why don't we understand it with interviews? Because nobody does that many interviews, not that many. You just don't see that many people in interview situations, and you're certainly not keeping track of how well they did, how well each of these people did in their interviews, and how well they did in your company, and then following them, the people you didn't hire, and seeing how they did in their companies. We don't do that. So it's not, in a sense, it's not our fault that we don't understand that the interview is such a bad guide. Well, is the interview such a bad guide? Yes, it's astonishingly bad. The correlation between interview ratings and performance in college, in any business where it's been examined, performance as a physician, performance as a military officer, the correlations run 0.1. One thing I want to ask early on, how many people speak correlation? If I say a correlation of 0.1, how many? Okay, not by any means everybody. Okay, so I'll be talking mostly in terms of odds rather than correlation. So what do you have to do to get this right? You have to frame the problem as one of observations plus error, and you have to remind yourself everywhere in life that human behavior observations are subject to substantial error. Now, we understand that, as I say, perfectly well with sports. We did a study where we asked University of Michigan students to tell us what they thought the odds were that if Billy got a higher grade on a spelling test than Bobby, that he would also at the next spelling test get a higher grade. And we also ask about basketball. Joan got a higher score than Jane at one basketball game. What's the likelihood she would at the next? And then we asked about 20 events. Billy scored higher than Bob on the average of 20 spelling tests during the year. What's the likelihood that he would in another 20? The odds, 20 odds and 20 evens. And here are the results, what people thought, reported in correlation terms. Correlations run from -1 to +1. 0 means no relationship whatsoever. +1 means a perfect relationship. In this case, it would mean if you thought that the correlation was 1, you would say, well, if he got a higher grade on one test, he's certain to get a higher grade on the next test. But these are reported in correlation terms. And notice that people's guesses about, that's combining basketball and spelling, their guesses just happen to be right on the money. They're exactly right about how much error is expected from these kinds of observations. They also understand that you get much stronger association between 20 scores and 20 other scores than between one score and one score. They don't understand the extent to which that's true. It actually goes up to near certainty. If Billy got, I mean, we have the data on these, we know that. We know what's going on here. If one kid gets a higher score on 20 tests, the odds are absolutely overwhelming that that kid will get a higher score on the next batch of 20 tests. Now, contrast this with what happens when, instead of looking at abilities, and specifically abilities where we have some clear idea about the degree of error that exists in observations, with traits. We ask people about, we said Jane is more friendly than Joan in one situation. What's the likelihood that she would be more friendly in the next situation in which you observe her? Or honesty. Friendliness and honesty were the two that we asked about. Notice what the actual data are. The correlation is 0.15. Correlations between any two behaviors that can be construed as indicators of a person's value on a particular personality trait almost never correlate with one another better than 0.2. Typically, it's more like 0.1. If the correlation is 0.15, that means you go from, if you're trying to say who's friendlier, Jane or Joan, that means you're going from what a coin flip or 50-50. I don't even know what she's done. I'm just going to say it's Joan because that came up heads. But if you observed her in one situation, the likelihood that you'll be able to make that prediction accurately goes up to about 0.56. It hardly goes up at all. It takes you a very long time to notice that you're making serious errors all the time. So here's what people think it is. People think if Jane is friendlier than Joan in situation number one, that the odds are 80% that she'll be friendlier in situation number two. I mean, that is spectacularly badly calibrated with reality. And we make these mistakes every single day. I mean, we're constantly not making friends we could have made because Joe seemed kind of like a jerk when I met him at the party. I mean, or let's take another case where the law of large numbers might matter. How much agreement would you expect between any two reviewers for a psychology article? In soft psychology, my kind of psychology, for the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. What would you think the odds would be if reviewer A gave Jones's paper a higher score than Johnson's paper? What are the odds that reviewer B would do the same? Let's just try some odds. I mean, it's 50-50. I mean, just no reliability at all. I mean, there's, psychologists just are flipping coins when they're judging each other. Okay, I see one. Please tell me you're not a psychologist. So how many people think it would be a 60% chance? 70? 80? Okay, 90? Okay, so we got takers. It's almost a flat distribution, takers across all the whole. How about between two reviewers, physicists, who are reviewing solid-state physics proposal for the National Science Foundation. How many people think that the association there would be only a 60% chance that if physicist A ranks this one over that one, that physicist B will do the same? How many people would say 60% chance? Only one. Physicist by any chance? Okay. 70% chance? 80% chance? 90% chance? Okay. Actually, the correlation in both cases is the same. It's 0.3. Which means you've gone from a coin flip of 50-50 to about 56 or 7%. Now, what would you think it would be for evaluations of business models by potential investors? So, I can't entertain you with the answer, I don't know, but I do know that I spent some time with folks in a hedge fund who really impressed me as being extremely bright people who really were doing their business quite well in many ways, but they only had two people judge each business proposal. If you increase the number of N, the reliability, that is the odds that you'll get the same answer from both, go up as a function of the number of the square root of the number of cases. If something is really important to you, you really got to have a good judgment about this. You got to ask a lot of people for anything that's at all subjective, even things that seem objective, like solid states physics proposals. In the U.S., baseball is very popular, and it turns out that the best player of his first year of the so-called freshman players, first year in pro ball games, is very rarely the best player the next year. And this phenomenon has a name. It's called the sophomore slump. We have a similar kind of concept for second novels, right? The difficult second novel is a great first novel, second novel, it just hit that jinx of this, or the album, the great first album, second one's not so terrific. Now, people will give for baseball and for everything else causal explanations till the cows come home. They'll say, well, the pitchers make the necessary adjustments, or well, the guy gets so cocky and he falls off his game because he's not paying attention. But let's think for a minute about how it is that best freshman ball player gets to be the best freshman ball player. Well, by having more talent, for sure, than the average player, but he's way out there. And to get way out there, he not only has to have a tremendous amount of talent, everything else had to go right. He got particularly good coaching the first 3 or 4 games. As it happened, he just did great and built confidence. He got engaged to the girl of his dreams. The next year, the great dice roller in the sky gave him an elbow injury that kept him out for the first 3 weeks, and his fiancée ditched him. Somebody else got the dice rolls that second year. This is just another way of saying all observations can be thought of as true score plus error, and there is error around a baseball score. If you ask people this, think there's no error? Well, of course there's error. Well, look, if there's error, then somebody who's way the hell out there has got to be expected to come back in. And this principle is called the regression to the mean, which is happening all around us all the time, and we're largely blind to nearly all the cases of it that are being presented to us every day. Extreme observations of events are likely to be followed by less extreme observations of the same type of event to the extent that there is variation, error, for observations of the type in question. And when we're going from one dimension to another dimension, this is especially true. Predictions for events of one kind based on observations of another kind have to take into account the degree of correlation between the two kinds of events. So you tell him the guy scored the 95th percentile of sense of humor. How do you think he scored on an IQ test? The average person, he probably scored the 95th percentile. So, oh, I see. So you think the correlation, the association between sense of humor and intelligence is almost perfect. Literally perfect. Oh, no, I don't think that at all. I mean, I know lots of very smart people and I have no sense of humor. We don't recognize that when we go from one dimension to another, you have to regress back for those extreme scores, just as you do within the distribution in question. Suppose I told you that I have a friend, who's a manufacturer's representative. Her name is Catherine. She loves her job. She likes to travel, and she's something of a gourmet. So she enjoys eating at restaurants that have been recommended to her. But she's discovered that typically, if she has a really excellent meal at a restaurant, subsequent meals are typically not as exciting as that first meal. Now, these poor University of Michigan freshmen again, if you ask them, why do you suppose this might be, you'll never get anything but a deterministic answer. They'll say, well, maybe the chefs change a lot, or maybe her expectations just got too high and they couldn't be met. If they've had a single statistics course, they're likely to say something like, well, you know, maybe it was just by chance she got such a good meal that first time. Which is right as far as it goes. If they've had a couple of statistics courses, they've had several statistics courses, they're likely to say something like, well, let's see, there are probably more restaurants in the world where you could get an excellent meal some of the time than there are restaurants where you could get an excellent meal all of the time. And if that's the case, and she has an excellent meal, you have to predict that the next meal is going to be less good, because she's probably at that more common kind of restaurant. That's another way of thinking about regression to the mean. My favorite example of regression to the mean is told by Danny Kahneman, who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. He spoke here a while back. He was talking to pilot trainers in the military. And he said, you know, psychologists have discovered that the best way to teach people something is to emphasize their good performance, tell them why it's good, and to de-emphasize the bad performance. Not as useful to tell them why performance was bad. Pandemonium breaks out in the room. You know, Professor, you don't know what you're talking about when it comes to pilot training. We found that if a guy makes a really excellent maneuver and we praise him for it, odds are it's not as good next time. Made it worse. If he does something really terrible, we scream at the son of a gun, he does better the next time. Think about it this way, the difficult second novel, or the jinx in albums. If someone's second novel was terrific and the first one had not been so good, would you say, gee, I guess he was subject to the freshman jinx? Not likely. It's only because we have an interesting case of extreme excellence. We have no recognition that we have no right to expect that the second score is going to be as high. Recently, the Insurance Institute of America did a study of the safety of automobiles. They reported on the deaths per model year of each of a huge number of autos. And they find such things as the Ford pickup. There are enormously more deaths per vehicle year associated with the driving the Ford pickup than there are the Volvo station wagon. So you ask most people, why do you suppose that is? They say, well, you know, I've heard about these Volvos, how safe they are, it's probably true. But I have a quiz for you. See if you can match the driver with the auto. We don't hand out autos at random. We don't say, Billy, you'll be driving a lovely powder blue station wagon. The problem here is called self-selection. The subject chooses not only the subject's level on a given variable, gets a Volvo station wagon, but the level on a host of other variables that are correlated with that variable. Safer drivers tend to buy Volvos than buy Ford pickups. But actually, the self-selection problem makes more sense, although it's a little odd to say it, when applied to the auto in this case. It's as if the auto selects the driver. And not only selects the driver, but also selects the number of miles driven per year and selects the conditions under which the auto is driven. And if you have self-selection, if you learn nothing else tonight, because this is the thing I most care about, please learn the concept of self-selection. If you measure something about a person and you now know you have an idea of what that person's score is on that, bear in mind that he's selected that score, not you. And any number of other things can vary as well. This becomes particularly important, and I guarantee you have read many, many findings like this. Men who take vitamin E have a lower likelihood of prostate cancer. Now, the thing about that is that men who take vitamin E are going to differ in all kinds of other ways from men who don't take vitamin E. They're going to have a higher social class on average, more likely to know that they ought to take vitamins. They're more likely to have the money to go out and buy vitamins. They probably have a better diet because if they're bothering to take vitamins, they probably care about their health enough to watch their diet and their cholesterol and their blood pressure, and they probably exercise. This actually has a name now in epidemiology. It's called the healthy user bias, because people who do things that sound healthy do other things that sound healthy. You're not going to find out whether vitamin E is good for you or bad for you until you do the randomized control experiment. Flip a coin, see who gets the experimental treatment and who gets the control, and you measure the outcome. Now, through the miracle of random assignment, you know that on average, subjects in one condition are identical to those in another. Every guy who's very rich, there's somebody else in the control group who's also rich. Everybody who has a lousy diet in the experimental group, there's someone in the control group who also has a lousy diet. So once you do this experiment, you can now find out what is the effect of vitamin E on prostate cancer. And the answer is vitamin E makes prostate cancer more likely. Hundreds of thousands of women in the world have taken hormone replacement therapy because epidemiologists found that women who take hormone replacement therapy have less likelihood of cardiovascular disease. But if you do the experiment, you find out that hormone replacement therapy increases the likelihood of cardiovascular disease. And the only way you're going to find that out is by doing an experiment. Now, people who do studies like this, purely correlational studies, where they're not doing the manipulating, they're just doing measuring, will say they've got this problem handled. They apply something called multiple regression analysis. And what this means is that they examine the association of each of a number of independent variables with a dependent variable, net of the association between every other variable and the dependent variable. Another way of putting this is to say the correlation of, they look at the correlation of X and Y controlling for subtracting out all the correlation between all variables that are correlated with both x and y. And in theory, that is a way that you can get rid of this problem. And I can point to cases where multiple regression and regression analysis applied in this way will get you the right answer. But often you can't identify all such variables. I mean, how many things might be different between people who take vitamin E and people who don't, or women who take hormone replacement therapy and women who don't? There are a limitless number. And anybody who thinks that tells you they can limit, is just blowing through his hat. You can't. You can't identify all variables. Of those that you do identify, you often can't measure them. Or even if you can measure them, it can be very difficult. Or how exactly should you measure? They'll tell you, epidemiologists will say, I control for social class. Well, you did. How did you do that? Did you look at the amount of money people make, or did you look at the prestige of their occupation, or did you look at their educational level? Those are all ways that are correlated with anything we would want to call social class. Or would you use some combination of those? And if so, how do you combine them? It turns out that in these epidemiological studies, it matters hugely sometimes. The hormone replacement therapy studies have, although the correlational data nearly always erroneously showed that hormone replacement therapy was effective, it ranged from very, very slightly effective to enormously effective. And a big part of the reason for the differences was how people bothered to measure social class. I'd like to be able to tell you, I'm a social psychologist. Like to say, I know how to measure social class. Actually, I don't. I mean, I don't know what's the best way to measure social class. And it's meaningless to say you control for variables with missing values. How many old ladies drive pickups? I mean, the Insurance Institute assured us not to worry about any possible artifacts in their findings because they controlled for age and gender. Both of the guys who drove Volvo station wagons had no accidents. And that's the way, in effect, the way they controlled for that. In 2007, when shortly after Barack Obama declared for the presidency, he was invited to have a discussion with Google employees. And the first question that the CEO, Eric Schmidt, asked him was, what's the best way to sort 30 million integers? And Obama said, well, I think the bubble sort would be the wrong way to go. Eric Schmidt hit his forehead and the audience broke out into applause because, in fact, that was a correct answer. And Obama then went on to say that he believed in evidence, he believed in science, and he would govern accordingly. And in the audience that day, there was a man named Dan Soroker who decided to go to work for Obama. As he put it, he had me at bubble sort. And there are a couple of several things that Google believes that I think we should all believe. They have a derisory term for how businesses make most of their decisions, which is you get the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion. But there's nearly always a better way, and that's A/B testing, where you just do the experiment, use a blue border, use a red border, which gets the most clicks. This is the kind of thing that Soroker did for Obama. He'd just say, well, which combination of image and text gets the most clicks? Is it the turquoise portrait? Is it a black and white picture of the family? Or is it a 5-second video of Obama giving a talk? Or is it learn more? Join us now or sign up now. I find that I'm just without intuitions about these things. You may or may not. But another expression they have around Google is assumptions tend to be wrong. The first people to really, really know this with social psychologists. Assumptions about human behavior, especially human behavior in novel situations, tend to be wrong. As it turns out, the most effective thing is the black and white photo and the legend, learn more. It's actually 40% more effective than the worst combination. That can translate into a lot of money and a lot of votes. But there's a number of other ways that businesses can make use of it. Grocery stores in the U.S., and I imagine here too, stock things by category. They don't tend to do that in Japan. They tend to stock things by type of meal being prepared. So which do you think is better? The impulse is, well, probably the American way is better for Americans and the Japanese way is better for Japanese. No, actually, the Japanese way, so far as we know, is better for everybody. It's certainly better for the grocer because people buy more food. So, oh, I forgot the Romano cheese. I can't make Italian food without that. And it's better for the health of the customers because they don't get home and say, oh my God, I forgot the damn Romano cheese, and pull something out of the freezer. Just try doing it. Suppose you wanted to sell more fruits and vegetables. There's two reasons for doing this. One is the profit margin is better on fruits and vegetables than on anything else in a supermarket. And the other is fruits and vegetables are better for your customers than most of what they're going to buy in the supermarket. It turns out that one thing you can do is simply to say the average person buys X number of dollars worth of fruits and vegetables in the store. That substantially increases fruit and vegetable sales. Or, and this is my favorite gimmick that was tried by the people who did this, say, please place fruits and vegetables in front of cart. That doubles the sales. So now, in your personal life, you have numerous opportunities. We all have huge numbers of opportunities that we don't take for doing experiments that are the only way to find out about something. Are you better off when you drink a cup of coffee in the morning? Are you more efficient? Or are you sort of more growly and difficult to get along with? If you just go for observations, just sort of trying to keep the track, you're not going to know. Because you had coffee yesterday because your husband happened to make it, and you didn't have it today because you were in a big rush, and you have a mess of data. The only way you're going to find out is flip a coin, coffee today, no coffee today. And is meditation good for you or not good for you? Is yoga good for you or not good for you? You need to get a base rate and keep track. A couple of anecdotes to end with. I don't have much time to talk about decision analysis. Many, many years ago, my wife and I bought a summer cottage, and we were absolutely at the end of our finances. We didn't have enough to buy furniture. So I decided I'll build the furniture. For some people, that would be a good idea. I was the kind of kid who always had parts left over after I built the model. So I said, well, I'll go take a class. So I went and took a class in woodworking. And at the end of 15 hours, I had a box. And dawns on me, this is just not the way to do it. I was not paying attention to the fact that I was paying a huge opportunity cost for trying to make my own darn furniture. Opportunity cost of any action. Here's the way economists think about the world. It's kind of depressing that everything you do has alternatives. And everything you do actually has a best alternative. And that best alternative is the opportunity cost of doing whatever it is you decided to do. In my case, there were millions of things that I would rather have done than make my own darn furniture. And the smart thing to have done would be to do what we actually did do, which was live pretty low on the hog for several months, bought dirt cheap furniture, and as we got richer, we got better furniture. Do you need to frame In order to be able to recognize opportunities, you need to frame actions as potential costs. Is this the optimal thing to be doing now? What costs are being paid for it? What else could I do that would cost less or benefit me more? Now, that all sounds pretty straightforward, but the problem is recognizing it. If you owned an office building and you needed an office yourself, you'd be likely to think if you use an office in your building, it's free. And in fact, an accountant might say it's free, but actually it's not free because you're paying an opportunity cost. And if there's another office you could get that's just as good as the one that you would use in your own building, but you can rent the one in your own building for more than you have to pay for an office in another building, you're paying an opportunity cost, which may be unacceptable. Economists don't do anything that they could hire a small boy to do. They don't mow their lawn. They don't pull weeds. They don't do their own taxes, because opportunity costs for all those things I'd rather be doing. My first year of graduate school, I worked on a project, a difficult project. It was on personality and something. I can't remember. I've repressed what it was about because it took a lot of work. And as I'm analyzing the data, my heart's sinking. I'm not finding anything here. So I took it to my advisor, Stanley Schachter, great social psychologist. Looked at it for an hour and says, "I'm sorry, kid, you win some, you lose some. There's nothing here." It's unacceptable. I mean, this is what I've done with myself in my first year of graduate school. So I dived back into the data, doing more analyses. I did a couple of supplementary studies, at the end of which, nothing. If I'd had an economist at my elbow, he would have said, "Wait a minute. Suppose somebody else had collected these crappy data. Would you be analyzing?" "Oh, no, it's ridiculous. I wouldn't be analyzing." I said, "Okay, what you were doing is you were trying to salvage the cost of doing this by trying to get something out of it, but you can't salvage it because it's gone." And The Economist has, in effect, a motto, which should be for everybody: "The rest of my life begins now." Now. And sunk costs are resources spent to attain a goal that can't be retrieved. You can't retrieve those resources. Suppose you you bought a ticket to a football game a month ago, paid £100 for it, and tonight's the night, but the star is not playing. Nothing really depends on the outcome, and it looks very much like it's going to rain. If you ask most people, what do you think you would do, go to the game or not? Most people say, "God, I would hate to waste that £100. To which the economist would say, "Honk, wrong. You can't waste it. It's gone. You can pay twice. You can pay once for the ticket and once for the tedium." Now, this is not going to get you very far, because you need a psychologist at the other elbow for something like this. Because you can frame it and say, "Yeah, it's true, I know I can't get it back, but it hurts." It produces what social psychologists call cognitive dissonance. And to reduce that cognitive dissonance, you say, lots of times I've gone to games, I wasn't expecting much, and they turned out to be really pretty interesting. That might happen now. The psychologist will say, here's the thought experiment you do. Suppose you hadn't bought the ticket. A friend calls you up and says, "I have tickets for the football game tonight. Do you want to go?" If the answer would be yes, I would. I'll be right over. Then by all means, go to the game. But if the answer would be, "You've got to be kidding. The star is not playing. Nothing depends on the outcome. It looks like it's about to rain," then you don't go. So you have to pretend the resource had not been expended. Would you still do this thing? Is an important goal. Well, the one thing that has struck me, and I've been doing research on this for a very long time, what struck me is how well folks did in the Industrial Revolution with getting people the cognitive skills that they needed. In 1760, in Britain, hardly anyone could read and write. By 1840, 70% of British could read and write. All of the other tools that I can identify that are important to function in the Industrial Revolution are out there. They're being learned. There have been huge changes. I see almost no change in people's ability to use the very tools that they may have learned in their profession. So we're going to be seen, I think, as ignorant and befuddled by our great-grandchildren. I hope. Thank you.
Do you make a distinction between smartness, intelligence, wisdom, and cleverness?